the beginning, and then we'll get right into it. So
And you don't have to politely look at me. You
No,
look at him the whole time.
I'll look at him. One of the
Yeah.
things I always say is, if you're being interviewed, look at
Very
the
good.
interviewer.
Right. Yeah, don't
Don't
stare
sit
into the
there, look at
camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, looking into the camera freaks the people out that are viewing it later, because it feels like you're staring at them and you're just like, ooh. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Oh, we're on. All right. My name is Robert Franklin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with Wayne
Wayne Martin.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On April 5th, 2018. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. I'll be talking with Wayne about his experiences living in the Tri-Cities and working at the Hanford site. And for the record, could you state and spell your full name for us?
Wayne Martin, Wayne Martin.
When did you first come to the Tri-Cities?
First time I came to Tri-Cities was like 1975.
Okay.
I came and did worked as an intern and then a couple of jobs here in the area.
And where were you from?
I'm an Army brat.
Oh, okay.
So I'm from a lot of places.
Yeah.
Since birth until I was 15 or 16, we moved all the time. A lot of different forts in Germany and the South and just a lot of different places.
Okay. And what did your father do in the Army?
My dad was a long-range artillery trainer, and which is why he moved a lot. And he was in the Army for 21 years. So we ended up, he got to pick his last station, which was Fort Lewis. And we had been to Fort Lewis once before. And so he picked Fort Lewis because he kind of liked the Northwest.
Mm.
And that's how we ended up in the state of Washington.
Oh. And when and where were you born?
I was born in Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Fort-
Although I don't think we were there very long before we moved.
Okay. And what year was that?
1954.
Okay. Did your father serve in the military when it was still segregated? Did you ever ask him about that?
I don't recall when the military was segregated, although he started, I believe, right around 1950s, if I recall.
Okay.
And he was Korean War. He was in the Korean War. Because he was from New Roads, Louisiana, and as he told me, the only way out of New Roads, Louisiana was to join the service, along with several of his other brothers and friends.
Where is New Roads, Louisiana?
It's about 30 miles north of Baton Rouge.
Okay.
Little small town. Very small town.
Have you been there?
Yes, I lived there when I was in 5th and 6th grade.
Oh, okay.
My father was set up to do 3 short-term, what they call temporary duty assignments. And so he plopped us down with my mother's family, because both of them were from New Roads. And we stayed in my grandmother's house when I was pretty much all of 5th and 6th grade, for as best my memory can be.
What was it like to or do you remember what year that was?
Okay, 6th grade, that was mid-60s.
Okay.
And to be honest, it was my brothers and I first real experience with racism. We had lived in posts, they call them posts, base for Air Force, post for Army. And we had lived in, like I said, Germany and a lot of different forts. And pretty much our lives were on posts.
Mm-hmm.
But going there was different.
Why do you think the Army was? Because certainly there were blacks and whites all from around the U.S., but especially from the South together in the Army. How was it? How was the racism different or more apparent in off post?
Well, if you know anything about the service, it's like forced integration. You are under command, and you are. And my father stated that they were subject to certain negative things if they didn't have a decent one. And when you're amongst the kids on post, everybody moved a lot. We all interacted with each other's for usually a pretty short time, and so we didn't really experience a lot of negative racial type tensions. You had a decent mix. I mean, I interacted with whites, Asians, and it was I always looked at it as a balance mix. When we went to New Orleans, Louisiana, I'll tell you an experience I had there. The very first one that really kind of shocked me is when we were driving into town, I saw a theater, and when we got moved in with my grandmother, and we were playing. We went to a Catholic school, is where my parents put us in the Catholic school, and we were playing with the kids in the neighborhood. And my brother and I, we were used to going to the theater. We always went to a movie on Saturdays on post.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, hey, we saw the theater. When can we go to the movies? And they looked at us like, what are you talking about? Well, when we came to town, there was a theater down there. And they basically said, well, that's not for us. We don't get to go to that theater. I said, why not? Well, that's only for white folks. And that was a shocker for my brother and I. We went home and asked my mom, and they politely explained things to us in a little more detail. So sometimes I think as you're growing up, you kind of get protected a little bit, by your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point on in that town is when I understood a lot more, because there were a lot other incidences that happened. When we went to Catholic school, it was Catholic school for blacks. The public school was for blacks, and then on the other side of town was for whites. And we started to see that difference. So that was when the real lights came on about racism. That's a long way around here answering your question, but
No, that's a wonderful, detailed answer. Were there still signs up when you were there for whites only, coloreds only, for public accommodations, or restaurants, drinking fountains, or restrooms, that kind of thing?
to be honest, as we lived there, you got to remember in 5th and 6th grade, we didn't explore much of the white side of town. Black side of town is where we stayed, played, went to school. So we didn't really see a lot of those. We saw I remember seeing maybe one when we went to the grocery store. But it wasn't a real big part of our experience there. We were informed about certain things. Certain things came to me later on in life that I didn't recognize at the time. The movie The Help.
Mm-hmm.
My aunt and several of the other of my aunts and other ladies in town, I remember them going off to say they're going to work, and they would be dressed in something similar to what you saw in The Help, but they never really explained to me that they were going to take care of a white family. And later on, after asking questions about it, that's what they were doing. And so some cases you feel a little bit like, why in the heck didn't people just explain things to us? And I think there's a lot of protectionism that occurs when you're younger. So get a little bit from the kids, going to school, but not as much as when later on in life you start to see and recognize things. So that was, like I said, that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So you said you first came here in 1975
Yes.
as an intern, and what was your internship?
It turned out to be more of a record keeping thing that I did for one of the contractors out here. At that time, I didn't work for P&L, which at that time it was actually Pacific Northwest Labs. I did that because a friend of mine, Nestor Mitchell, which is the son of C.J. Mitchell, had said, hey, you can come down here and get a summer job and to make some dollars. And so that's how I ended up coming here.
How did you know Nestor?
Nestor, he went to school at WSU.
And is that where you went to school as well?
That's where I went, Washington State University.
And what made you choose Washington State University?
When you're young, you make decisions in odd ways. When I was going through high school, one unfortunate thing that happened was I lost my mother at 17. I was the oldest, and she passed away when I was in 11th grade.
Oh.
And so I became the kind of like the surrogate mother. My brother's 32 months younger than me, and my other brother's 10 years younger than me. So he was 7, I was 17. I tell you that because the whole time I was growing up, I was always told, you're going to go to college. You should go to college. All my aunts said, it's always evident that you were smart enough. You should go to college. Well, I've always intended to go to college, right? But that event caused me to have to think a little bit. But then, when the time came, my dad said, well, I'm not going to be able to afford to send you much. I got a few scholarship things. And I said, well, I wanted to stay in state because of the cost. And there was really only 2 options, University of Washington and Washington State. And I said, Washington State is just far enough that I don't have to worry about being too close to home. And a friend of mine, Dave Ware, he was a good friend of mine in high school. We both wanted to go and possibly become wildlife biologists, and we figured that WSU had a good program. So I picked it, applied, and was accepted, and that's how I ended up there.
How was campus life at WSU? Is that a big? I know you've been an Army brat, so you moved around a lot. Yeah. But was that a big change? I understand there were. You would have been there in the early '70s.
Yeah.
Right, and that was kind of a period of some activism, turbulence on campus, and real attempts to create multicultural opportunities for people.
Coming out of high school, there was a lot of issues in high school, at the Clover Park High School, and I remember there being, you might want to call them racial riots, but racial disturbances, racial interactions, and on campus. I came up in the year where when we said the national anthem, we said, and justice for some. We used to yell that out really loud. And moved on into WSU. And WSU, there was a very small African American population, or very few minorities. And, you used to get looks, and you kind of wondered what people might be thinking. But there wasn't a whole lot of in your face as there was when I was in high school. You heard about deals, talked to people, they were experiencing certain deals. But to be honest, when I went to school there, I worked a lot because I couldn't afford not to. And a lot of my time was spent working and going to class and studying. That's really, matter of fact, Nestor and a couple of other of my friends, they didn't study as much. Matter of fact, Nestor ended up leaving after his 3rd year. I think they partied a little bit too hard. But with that, they would talk to me about experiences they were having. They had a lot more free time than I had. And that's how I heard about most of them. Didn't have a lot of in-your-face situations. So it was reasonably comfortable, but like I said, I probably worked 30, 35 hours a week.
Wow.
While I went through school.
Wow.
I had to play a little bit of soccer because there was a soccer club there. I learned soccer when I was in Germany. When I came to the United States, not very many people played, so they had a club, and I got to play that for maybe about 2 of the years, 2.5 of the years. And interacting with those guys, you interacted with a lot of people from other countries. because that's who played soccer.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting to run into the people that were from Italy and Germany, and when we went around to different schools and played. So got a little bit more of a culture that way than just at the campus.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. How large was the black community when you were there, and was it a close community?
One, I don't know how large it was. It was small.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as a close community, when you don't have very many people, then people don't come together very much.
Mm.
And I don't really ever see myself as an activist. Heard about things. People call a few meetings, you'd go to them, but I didn't see a large groundswell. Let's just put it that way.
Oh, okay.
You'd have to go back and maybe get some data on what the size is.
So what was your major?
When I went there, my intent was to become a wildlife biologist, so I majored in wildlife management. And along the way I minored in chemistry. Only because I was taking chemistry classes and kind of liked chemistry. And they say you only need X number of credits and you get a minor. And at the time, I just, okay, that's nice. I'll do that. And in the end, it worked out to be advantageous for future things that I did. But wanted to be, me and Dave, we used to go fishing a lot.
And who? Sorry?
David Ware.
Oh.
David was a good friend of mine. A white guy that we became pretty good friends. And he lived down the street, not very far from us. And we always used to do stuff together. And so, we're going to go into game department. And that's what I originally went for.
Right.
Didn't work out that way, but.
Do you remember which contractor you worked for when you came out here?
I want to say Westinghouse, but I might be wrong. It's been a while.
Yeah, I understand. And you said it was mostly record keeping?
Yeah, it was just some record stuff, and it was a lot of paper stuff, which actually I didn't care as long as I got a paycheck.
How did you hear about Hanford and why'd you come out?
Through Nestor. That's how I heard for the one summer. How I ended up selecting P&L actually was C.J. Mitchell, because what happened was C.J. was recruiting on campus around the time. And I didn't.
At WSU.
At WSU, and I was getting close to finishing, and Nestor says, look, my dad's recruiting up there. You might check with him and see if there's, potential for a job down here, because he had come down, established himself for about a year, and had a house, and I was looking at game departments, Oregon and Washington, and there were some openings, but then CJ started talking to me. He says, hey, P&L has things in the area of for wildlife and studies of wildlife, and you should check into it. So I did, and be honest, what ultimately made my decision was the amount of money they were going to pay me relative to the other amount of money. Again, I looked at the salaries and I looked at that, and then he talked to me about it, and he says, hey, and they have, there's a possibility for lots of different things you could do at P&L. And at that time it was P&L. And I said, okay, and then put my deal in, and what they told me was, we have a department called Water and Land, and there's a job coming in for a project that's going to start in the February, which I was getting done in June.
Mm-hmm.
But you have a chemistry background, and what we'll do is we can give you a job as a chemical technician for that 8 months until this job opens, then you can transfer. Well, again, I was looking at how much they were paying, and I said, I could do that. So I accepted the job, and it was a rotating shift job. Again, not being very wise or understanding what rotating shifts really do and really do to your body. That was the last time I ever worked a rotating shift of any kind. That was murder. But that's what brought me here.
What was it? What is a rotating shift?
Every week you change from days to swing to graveyard.
Whew.
every week.
Wow. That
And
sounds. How long would it take your sleep? How long would it take your like sleep schedule to adjust to your new shift?
I would say it never did. I was a walking zombie in many cases. You know, it's a forced thing, but you're young enough. That's really what it was. You're young enough to adapt.
Yeah.
And the work was, we were actually working out in one of the buildings that had a lot of radiation and high rad fields, and that's what we did. So the work was active enough. So you never sat anywhere. You were constantly moving. So that's what I did.
Do you remember what building you were in?
The 324 building.
That sounds.
There's 325 and there's 324. 320, I think it was 324. The one that had all the manipulators. The actual project at that time was, they were looking at fuel rods and chopping fuel rods and formulating for glass mixture, and that was one of the first vitrification projects. That's what I worked on.
Wow.
Yeah, it was. That was my first introduction to radiation and all of the training you have to have and protective things you have to do.
Kind of not what you thought you were going to do when you were in school.
No. that first job was not. But you know, it got me started. So it was a good in that sense.
What were your first impressions when you arrived down to
Here?
Yeah.
Warm. I like the warm compared to on the west side, the rain. Since I had a connection through Nestor and his family, so I had that connection and was able to get engaged with their family and all of Nestor's friends when I first came. So my landing here was pretty soft, as I would say it, and I enjoyed it. Got to experience a lot of the lab and got to understand more about the lab as I looked around, because one of the things we were saying is, because this one job was going to open, I was periodically, when I had time, I would check into that organization and then read a lot of materials about what the lab did. Coming into it, you know, you get a lot of colorful pamphlets and all this stuff about, well, you know, it's not untrue, but it's highlights things in a way that makes you a lot more attractive than really what was going on. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I understand. We have a lot of that material in our archives, and yeah, it certainly paints. I mean, it's like all promotional material, right? It paints the rosiest picture that it possibly can, without outright lying.
Right.
Yeah. Where was the first place you stayed after you arrived?
There was a house that Nestor had, and it was on Hawaii Place in Kennewick, not far from the Columbia Center.
Okay.
So he already had a house. He had a roommate. They had an extra room, and like I said, it was a soft landing.
Yeah, no kidding. What was the hardest aspect of life in this area to adjust to?
There wasn't a lot to do for young folks. We did a lot of traveling outside, going to Seattle and making contacts with some of my friends from college in other towns. And so, like I said, there wasn't a lot. I got introduced to a lot of different things in this area with Nestor and his family. You know, enjoying the water. Nestor and I, we got boats and played around on the water, and I already had a passion for outdoors, fishing. Got a little bit more into hunting. David introduced me to hunting when I was in high school, and so I got to doing more hunting. So I ended up meeting people who after being here about a year or so, met a friend Doug Sherwood, and he was really into outdoor activity. So I made connections pretty easily. I think, to be honest, as I grew up, with us moving as much as we did, you learn to make friends or make relations pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
That I would say that's a characteristic that I've acquired, and I think it came from moving a lot and then interacting with people. So you make friends quick. Otherwise, you're a loner.
Right. Right.
And I think that helped me in connecting with people here, and a wide variety of folks. So, like I said, it was a pretty soft landing. And from there, I mean, I never had any intentions. I didn't think of. Some people come and say, "Well, shoot, I'm staying here a couple of years and then I'm off to something different." Didn't really come with that intent. I was just coming off of being in college, being poor, what I considered poor most of the time. I actually had learned about food stamps when I was in college. Some guy says, for as much as you make and stuff, you should check into the food stamps. And that was until, because I went 5 years. It wasn't until I was in I think my fourth year, or right before my fourth year, that I found out that I could get food stamps, and that helped out a lot. But learning, coming out of that kind of environment and coming to establish and having a decent salary, again, all of that was a big leap for me.
Yeah.
And I use that term soft landing because some people get hardships coming out. Very difficult to find a job, very difficult to make a connection into a town, right? I didn't really have those.
What did how long did you work the analytical chemistry job?
That was 8 months.
Okay. And then what did you do after that?
Then I got into the Water and Land Group, and it was what you find out when you go and want to go into wildlife management and wildlife biology. You really don't do a lot of studying of animals. What you study is habitat, because if you want to control the population of a particular species, you control their habitat. You control how much food they have, how much hiding cover they have, how much water accessibility they have. So I had a lot of soils. Botany, and by going in Water and Land, I got hooked up with a group that did soil science. And that soil science group, we looked at a lot of different aspects of soil. But what connected me initially was it got into waste and waste of soils. And one of the very first big projects was uranium mill tailings remediation project, where they were looking at these big waste sites from the mining of uranium. And I had just come out of this group that was a lot of radiological, so I ended up learning a lot about radiation. So it was kind of a perfect project. The one thing you have to understand about P&L, it's all about projects. You get to work on projects. If you don't have a project, you don't have a job. So whatever projects needed people, you worked on that. And if you had a set of skills that would help that, so by having a lab background and then having a background in understanding environments, it was kind of a little bit of a match. And that's where I first got connected into waste management.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what kicked off the first beginnings of what I consider the primary elements of my long-term career.
Which was around waste management?
Yes, around waste management, and then it ended up focusing on geochemistry.
What is geochemistry?
Geology, chemistry. So the chemistry of the earth. So understanding the interactions of water, soils, and how they interact, how once you put waste in the ground, it transports, subsurface transport. And so if you look at the things I've told you I had in my background, they all kind of came together in that field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned earlier that about your soft landing on the Tri-Cities and this connection with the Mitchell family, who was a real, one of the big families in the area that people remember. CJ was a very public spirited person. So how would you describe life in the community? What did you do in your spare time? And do you remember any particular community events?
There were different types of events, but there wasn't. The first off, the black population is not that large.
Mm-hmm.
I would say a couple percent. I don't believe it has changed much over the years. I mean, I don't follow the population numbers. I did follow some of the population or the employment numbers within P&L over time. But we would go to. We created a lot of our own events, to be honest.
Such as?
It'd have potlucks, and we would have, I would say, I know that there were some black churches that would throw some events, and so I would go to some of those.
In Pasco?
In Pasco.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I got to meet a number of other black families, the Sparks family, which is a pretty good sized family here. I'm trying to think of this other name. It started with a B. I can't remember the name of the family right now, but maybe it'll come to me. So that's how I got to meet a number of other black individuals in the community. And they are the ones that explained to me a lot of the history, their experience, and about the different cities. Matter of fact, they're the ones where I had heard about what they call the sundown law in Kennewick. I said, man, he goes, you realize back not that long ago in the 60s where, blacks had to be back across the Green Bridge. At that time, it was a Green Bridge.
Yeah.
And any person that was in Kennewick at the time had to be back in Pasco. And, of course, not even sure if that law is still on the books. How sometimes there's laws on the books but just aren't enforced?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that law ever got officially removed. How's that? Now, take that for what it is. I don't know. But they explained to me these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so they asked, well, where are you going to live? And I said, well, I was living in Kennewick and with Nestor. And he says, yeah, we know the Mitchells. And many of the Mitchells lived in Richland. And I got to know a lot of his brothers, and they had one sister. Cameron actually came up and was at WSU for a little while, his younger brother, while I was finishing up. So that's how I ended up meeting and going to different events. So like I said, there wasn't a lot to do here. You had to make a lot of your own activities, and we spent a lot of time going to Seattle or Portland, up to Spokane, for different reasons. To be honest, a lot of them for what you might call partying. So it was. I didn't experience a lot of racial deals. Every once in a while you hear somebody call a name out of a passing car, and you'd look at the car and then they'd be gone. But I didn't really experience a lot of in your face. I think I might have said that before here, although others had. It could have been who I was around. Could have been just I didn't go to certain facilities, or it was difficult to find getting your hair cut. Another reason why I would go to Pasco, because you would find folks. And I found a woman who everybody knew, and Carmen Wood was her name. And
was it difficult in that you weren't welcome there, or a white barber would refuse to cut black hair, or was it just you were much more comfortable in East Pasco?
Not necessarily. Well, not necessarily East Pasco, but in Pasco.
Or in Pasco.
Once you talk to folks, you would say, okay, it is a little more comfortable in Pasco. There wasn't more black faces in Pasco. I got introduced to, because you get your hair cut. Look, I mean, you're not going to go to a white barber, not initially. You're going to ask and say, who cuts, man? And they would tell you.
Right.
And you would go to that barber, and there was a black barber in Pasco, And then later on, I got introduced to Carmen, and Carmen, she was in several different spots, and she always did a good job. So she also knew a lot was going on.
How so?
Oh, she'd say, well, you heard about such and such, and what happened to her at work? You know, there were some incidences of people, racial situations, in some of the contractors. Interesting, you said something about union people that you might have interviewed. Some of the black individuals who were in unions were, they got a harder reaction and a lot more negative reaction than I did within P&L. Now, I would call white collar blue collar. And I think the blue collar situation, a lot of times, those guys got interfaced and had to react with people who were a little more vocal about their opinions. And they also experience lack of opportunities within their jobs, promotion, and we would end up talking about that. I can't say that I had a lot of that in P&L. Oh, I mean, I would talk to a few of the other black individuals there, and they would say, yeah, well, you know, to get a job in such and such, you got to know X, a person. And some of the black individuals didn't see promotions like they thought they should have seen within P&L. But the number of people, of black individuals within P&L is very small. When I looked at the numbers, I never saw more than, it's less than 100. Okay. Matter of fact, I remember always seeing the number floating between 50 and 75, and the number of staff at P&L increased from like 2,800 to 4,500-ish that I recall watching those numbers. And that number of black individuals stayed very low. There seemed to be people attempting, as I would say, to bring about diversity. The Hispanic population increased, but of course what you have to recognize with the National Laboratory, it doesn't recruit locally. I mean, so it doesn't have to reflect the local demographics.
Right.
It has to reflect the national demographics, as they always say. And so, because they recruited nationally and internationally, which tend to make sense, but there are some jobs, hate to say it, you don't need to be international to do.
Yeah.
Janitorial, let's pick. You know, they have all those types of jobs. Welders, some of the people in the bargaining units. I got to talk to a number of them. So, back to the original deal. I didn't experience as much of it as I heard about people who were in other contractors in the site, on the site. And I think you'll have to compare my knowledge or experience or anecdotal information with others who may have truly experienced it.
Sure. You mentioned the barbershop earlier. Is that a real kind of locus of the community? Was that one of a major kind of meeting points or locus for the black community in the area?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You'd go in there and you would get to hear about a lot of things. I always would say, I have a scientific, my background's in science, and I'm very careful about taking a broad input of information and then deciding what's real and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that said, you'd hear of a story. Yeah, so I'd go and check with somebody else and know, what did you hear? What's happening? And they'd have a little bit different twist on what really happened.
Sure.
I've also been a manager for a long time. And not something just necessarily racial, but when an incident happens, it's not always as it is first initially reported. You
Yeah.
have to go gather it. So the same thing goes for things that are race-based. Go and really find out what really happens. But more often than not, it was, things did happen, and you have to take them. And I didn't, as a black individual in the community, I'm going to be careful.
Right.
And if somebody tells you there's a certain place that you shouldn't go, then you don't.
Yeah. Did you attend church?
No, to be honest, not. I wasn't a regular. I was raised Catholic. Okay, so I went to Catholic school, went to catechism. My brother went to Catholic school. So yeah, we always went to Catholic church. But once I got into college, just stopped. Just wasn't a major goal of mine. It wasn't. So I never did.
Sure. No.
So it wasn't until later on, after being married and something, I started going to a more interdenominational church. Because I am a Christian, I am faithful in that sense, but I'm not sure what your life is like, but you tend to flow the way everyone you're around flows. And
oh yeah, no, no, absolutely no judgment. I don't. Don't go to church. So so I understand completely. But I was forced to go as a kid, and so was my wife. She went to Catholic school all 12 years, and you just kind of it can have the opposite effect when you're an adult. But I was going to ask because I asked that question because it's my understanding from a lot of these interviews and research that the African American churches in Pasco played a large role in the community, and you would kind of mention that you would go to events at a couple of them. So I was just going to ask, like, for you or what you saw, what role did church play in the African American community in the Tri-Cities?
For many blacks, it was the bedrock for them. It is where they could go and actually feel comfortable, go and commiserate with individuals who are of their same upbringing. Many that may have come from the South, which a lot of them did and their families did. The church was a central point for the African American community. Should be, and well recognized and that still exists today. And that is how it was in Pasco.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find myself attracted going to doing that. It just wasn't wasn't something I really wanted to do. But I knew a lot of black individuals that did. And, for them, it made a big difference. Black churches help people cope, with what was happening around them. It was a central point for discussion. It was a central point for a lot of the families and helping, encouraging the youngsters to make those next steps. So, yeah, I knew that Morning Star is one of the churches that probably, I would say it's probably the biggest one, but I'm not sure. And so I heard a lot about them. The Mitchells, they went to the Baptist church.
New Hope.
Yeah. But they didn't corral, because Nestor never went. So we never really went that direction.
Right. I mean, it's the people. Yeah. No, it's.
So that's about as much as I know about the churches.
Okay.
And with time and on time, because I've been here 40 years. I mean, I've always heard about them, interact with people who had, and gone to some of their gospel events, gospel singing events, and I'll tell you, you're always extremely welcomed in open arms in those churches. There's no doubt about that.
That's good to know. You were planning to do some outreach to the churches and talk with some of the folks there and hopefully interview the pastors about their roles in the black community.
That would be a very good thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was not our original idea. It was the idea of access and Tanya and Vanessa. Do you recall any family or community activities, events, or traditions, including food, that people brought with them from the places they came from?
Well, soul food always the case with black individuals. But to be honest, the thing that I learned here and the food that I learned here that I ended up liking is Mexican food. I mean, it was, when in Pullman there wasn't a lot of, you ate freaking dorm food.
Still isn't any good Mexican food in Pullman.
Or you cooked your own.
Yeah.
But here it was everywhere, and it was inexpensive, and a taste that I wasn't familiar with. I mean, we only lived in one Fort Huachuca. I think that was in Arizona. Fort Huachuca, and I don't even remember a lot of it then. So I wasn't exposed to it that much. But coming here, and then you learned a lot about Hispanic food, and damn, that stuff ain't good.
Yes, it is.
But people did bring a lot of their traditional Southern foods. I knew how to cook a lot myself. My mother was very good at teaching us how to cook. So we.
Did she teach you how to cook soul food?
Yes.
Type stuff. Yeah.
My as I look back on what my mom did for us or did for me, probably not knowing she was going to pass early, she taught us how to iron our clothes, wash our clothes, taught us how to cook. She was a stay-at-home mom because we moved all the time. And in the end, that actually worked out extremely well for us, for me, after she passed, because then I had to do all that, because my dad was still in service, so he had to go, and so I was the one that ended up taking care of a lot of that. But as I moved on as a young man, I had to take care of myself, which was, that's not something I saw in a lot of other young people. I don't want to say both female and male, but most of the males didn't hardly do any of that.
Yeah.
But my mom taught, and when I lived in the South, you got a real good understanding. And of course, when we visited our aunts and uncles, there was a migration from New Roads to L.A. So I have a lot of relatives that live in L.A. And whenever you go to their houses, they'd always have food cooking. There'll always be Southern type cooking. So I ended up learning how to do it myself. And even today, I mean, I can still eat grits. You have to go. You're not going to go to a restaurant around here and find grits. if you do, you found something interesting. I bring up that one food because that's something from the South. So here in the Tri-Cities, not a lot. There's a couple of soul food places now, but you go to some families, they would have some black families, and you'd have a meal other than what I cook for myself. So again, it's kind of odd that the one food that really was new to me was Hispanic cuisines. I still, like I said, today I love it. I go to taco wagons,
Yeah, no, me too. It was a real pleasant.
Yeah.
I grew up in Alaska and lived in Hawaii.
Ooh, Alaska.
And it, not really food meccas. Besides the kind of the normal Chinese food and the normal American food, and so moving here was, the variety and abundance of Mexican food. I've always loved Mexican food, and it's pretty legit here. You can get as legit as you want to go.
Yes, you can.
Which is great. What about community activities or events like things like Juneteenth, or did you attend any of those?
Yeah, I probably for Juneteenth, I think over the years I've gone to about a half a dozen.
And why is that celebration so important? The African American community.
As you look at past history, it was an event that most of the black community would lean toward. A lot of things that are, people will ask the question, well, why do you have events like that are separate from the white community? And not only that, but anything with having to do with Black history. I've read a lot of books on Black history. Our society, as I was growing up and going to school, it never highlighted much of the Black history, which actually, as I got older, really upset me
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't know these things.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't in the book. So Juneteenth is just one other event. They wrapped the beauty pageant around that particular event because it was an event which helped the changing of recognition of slavery and so forth. But all other aspects of Black history and highlighting it was so that's not forgotten. And here in the Tri-Cities, there wasn't a lot of events. I can't remember when Black History Month was actually established. Sad that I don't know the actual dates, but when that thing happened, I know I did a lot more within PNL as time went on to lift the people's consciousness around what the Black experience in the Black history has done for America. People will question, why should there be something separate for you? And I always say to them is, if we didn't do it, you may not have ever really known. So we want you to know that a bedrock of the United States was built on the backs of Blacks. And people need to recognize that. Not only white individuals or Hispanic individuals, but Black individuals. I mean, some Black individuals really don't know the history.
Mm-hmm.
They've not, if they didn't go to college and get exposure, they're going to get what's ever fed to them.
Mm-hmm.
And without highlighting it, and they get to see certain things they may not have known. I just went to the Smithsonian African American Museum of History. I've now gone twice. Anybody I say you need to go, and you need to walk through that a couple of times to understand the lineage there. I say all of that because if an event happens here in town, you need to go and understand it. I mean, any person should go to it and understand some of the aspects of it. So Juneteenth, back to the original question, is just one other way to highlight an event in Black history.
Mm.
Some people say, well, why did you have one just for Black girls? Well, in the Tri-Cities, I'm not sure if very many Black girls would make it to in the Miss Tri-Cities pageant. Now, was there something in that pageant that made it so that Black individuals wouldn't do very well in that pageant? I don't really say that I would go there because I don't know. I would be making a falsehood.
Mm-hmm.
But with that event, it was more about the Juneteenth event and Black individuals being highlighted for their experience and their talents associated with that event. So hopefully, you're going to always get your naysayers and negative folks about just about anything. But it's important to have those. The people who have done that, the ones that also have supported the awards, one for African American kids for educational awards. There's also HAP, the Hispanic Academic Achievement Program. There's also the African American Achievement Program to bring funds to create scholarships for African Americans and for Hispanics. And people will say, well, why just for them? And I'll keep going back to, there's sometimes a competition that they don't win in the big scheme of things. If you just pool everybody in one set, you don't see the attention given to the minorities that are there. And trying to create some things and give advantages to some of the folks that don't get those. if certain people were to see my interview, they would say, "Well, we've heard that before, and they just don't want to agree." But we can agree to disagree.
Yeah. Certainly. In what ways were opportunities limited because of segregation or racism?
Here in the Tri-Cities?
Yeah.
During my time here?
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing I can...
That's fine. Or were they? Did you see anything?
I would say that there has been some, because I would always question why haven't we seen more, and this was within the lab, why haven't we seen more black individuals in interviews? It came from, to be honest, where I first got my eyes opened up was in the mid-'80s. Dr. Wiley, I'm sure some people may have brought up that gentleman's name. He is the one who, he became my mentor, and he exposed me to a lot of what was possibly going on within the laboratory that he wanted to see bring about a change. So I can only speak to what I experienced in the lab. Outside the lab, it's what people would say would happen, that you would hear. And I already kind of covered that. You'd hear different things. But in the lab, there were situations where you could see that there was something not quite right. As I said, I told you the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? So he helped me ask questions and improve my understanding of what he saw during his time in the laboratory. Now remember, he came from the South. He went to Tougaloo, it's a historically black college. As a matter of fact, that was one of the very first things he hooked me up into, is doing a lot of things with the National Urban League and going around the country interacting with historically black colleges. Because I will say that, I go to a lot of these conferences and get papers and whatever. I rarely see a black individual. Rarely. And he went through and explained to me why we're not seeing a lot in some of the things that are. And so therefore, that translates into not seeing a lot of them coming through our interview process if they aren't at those, right? It took a long time for me to see and understand and interfacing with a lot of historically black colleges. In that particular case was to let them know that science is an option. But in the lab, there has been certain situations that occur. Like I said, a lot of things are not blatant or just obvious.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to dig a little to understand why you're seeing what you're seeing. And Bill helped me to understand a lot of that, and I became a lot more proactive within the lab to bring about some of the changes and getting some individuals interviewed in the interview process. Again, I mean, nothing's, with time as time changes, you have to understand that things are subtle, right? And sometimes you aren't, I had a job, so I spent a whole lot of time investigating that kind of thing. I'm mostly trying to keep my credentials up and doing what's necessary in that, both in the lab and outside the lab. But it took me a little bit, but I got a lot more active in understanding what's going on in the lab and encouraging and getting more diversity within the lab, and did a lot more things, helping managers, helping our internal human resources department engage.
How would you describe your relationships with your coworkers and your supervisors and management when you were at the lab?
Actually, I had a very good technical mentor. His name was Jeff Cerny, who, white male, who took me under his wing and taught me a lot, and gave me a lot of opportunity. Engaging with most folks, I think, and this is my own perception, is I have a general rule of saying the best thing you can do is perform. Bill Wiley said, you know, you have to have the credentials. Without the credentials, they don't even really let you in the door. And then perform. So I had two paths I started off on. One, getting credentials, and the other, performing in my workspace. And people picked me up on a lot of projects because I had a performance rep, very good performance rep. And once you get that and people get comfortable that if they put you on their project, they're going to get what they paid for.
Yeah.
The credential route was not something, I'll tell you honestly, no frickin' way was I going back to college. My first experience in college in 5 years, long, drawn out, and you know, I figured that was enough. I should be able to get a good paycheck, and I should be able to launch, right? You know, Dr. Wiley said, "You are sadly." It's sad that you have that perception because it's not going to work. Long story short, I went back and did the master's thing. Did that. Took me 4 years. And during that 4 years, I got married, had a couple kids, and
What was your master's degree in?
radiological sciences, study radiation.
Oh, when did Dr. Wiley come to the lab?
Ooh.
Was he there when you started?
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
He was in the ranks. I want to say he came there in the late 60s.
Okay. How long was he manager of the lab when you started?
When I first interacted with him on a one-to-one basis, he had become the lab director.
Okay. Director, sorry.
Yes, became the lab director. And I had knew of him, you know, in the lab, but I didn't have a lot of, his area was biochemistry, microbiology. The lab is set up around projects, and if the project subjects don't overlap, you don't interface with folks.
Right, yeah.
So I knew of him, but like I said, my relationship with him started in the mid-'80s. Yeah. So.
How were you treated on the job by your coworkers and supervisors?
Well, I didn't really, again, didn't really experience a lot of negative. If they held some kind of negative feelings, they didn't make it obviously known. So I got along well with folks.
What kinds of interactions did you have with coworkers and supervisors outside of work?
Not a lot. Pretty much focused on work with them. I had a couple of people who I met on the job that became really good friends. Doug Sherwood and Brian Opitz. We became good friends, two white males. And that part, I did get a couple of folks that I knew and interacted a lot with. Then later on, there was a few. As time went on, I picked up a few more that I did a few things outside. But for most of the professional folks, not a lot.
Could you describe the working conditions?
In what way?
When you were at the lab, like kind of what environments did you work in?
I'm an experimentalist. So when you say environments, that's a big term. Now, so I don't know if you meant the environment working environment, physically in a lab doing your things, or the relational environment. So which one you want?
Both.
Relational, I only really focused on a few people who I felt comfortable with, that I felt were actually giving me good scientific tutelage. And Jeff Cerny was one, that's for dang sure. A couple other scientists, Ken Krupke, he's a kind of hard nose. Trying to think. I can't remember the one guy's name now. There was a couple other scientists who, Don Rye was another. He was an East Indian background. They were helpful. They were, and I think a lot of it came from is that I don't give up very well. And they could see it, and no matter what, I kept pushing them. I said, I don't understand this, you know. I need to understand this. What book you got, you know? I'm used to books. Give me a book, you know. And I come back with a lot of questions. And I think what, if you really showed initiative and really wanted to, you got a very good reception from the science community. And again, once given a task and you performed for them, they got what they wanted, they came back, they kept coming back. And that was how things migrated into me being involved a lot more. So the tutelage part, the working with folks, the experimental side, I learned a lot about safety. Working with radioactive materials, you had to be very diligent about what you touched, how you dressed, you know, how you handled. It's different than working in a non-rad. So operationally and safety-wise, that built up a very strong working skill set that not very many people had. I never had contamination issues. I always got what they wanted in a reasonable time. And then I was building up the academic part, so I made very good connection between the two. So when they got stuff from me, it had already been thought through. And I think those two environments, I learned a lot. I got a lot of, me as one person in there, I was okay. Others didn't experience what. Of course, again, there wasn't a lot of black individuals. Very few. A few Hispanics, but mostly white individuals, to be honest. I mean, I think part of my, again, if you go back to my background, I was around white people a lot. So I wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't an issue for me to walk in the room and start talking to them.
Sure.
Which I think some of them initially were not too comfortable.
Some of the white individuals.
Yes, they not quite knew how to react. But if I just focused on work, then there wasn't a whole lot of issue. I just didn't talk about stuff about outside work. Then they were okay. So you learn.
Were there any people that you were able to talk to about stuff outside of work? Have kind of more.
Yeah, Doug and Brian, we talk a little bit about what the racial things I experienced. And they didn't see a lot of it, but Doug had a real good friend, Mark Francis, black individual, and actually, ironically, he was his first roommate, and he actually went to Whitworth, and I played soccer against Mark, and then we all became roommates. Mark was from original background from Trinidad, but grew up in New York, and was out here.
Wow.
Believe me, yeah, man. It wasn't good. I mean, it wasn't the greatest thing going to Whitworth, and Doug went to Whitman, in Walla Walla,
Mm-hmm.
where there's hardly any blacks who went to school there.
Oh, I would imagine.
Yeah, but Doug has the right kind of personality, and Mark and I, we would talk, and he was tell me the things he experienced, and so as roommates, we would hear and see, and then you just learn where to go, where not to go, who to talk to, who not to talk to.
Yeah.
But as far as in-time work, I had a few relationships that came off of it, but and again, there's other people. Hopefully, you'll get some other individuals that may have been in P&L that could tell you what they experienced. I'm sure CJ must have said something.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned where to go and where not to go.
Yes.
And that's something that comes out in a lot of interviews. That's kind of, get passes through the vine, in this informal. Do you have any examples of where were places that to go and where were places that you avoided?
There were some clubs. If you wanted, you didn't want to go out to the smaller towns, Findlay, Burbank, Benton City. Do your shopping in town. You never know what you're going to get if you go out there. So, they didn't speak a lot about Walla Walla. They're saying, well, Walla Walla's, there's really not much for you out there. So, wouldn't go. Now, that may give Walla Walla a bad rap, but I'm going to go by what people who've been living here tell me. And if I don't really need to go, then go. There are certain restaurants, they would say, well, you might not get as good a service there as if you went to this one over here.
Right.
So I'm going to try to stay away from names so much, because
No, that's fine. I was just kind of trying to.
That is how you end up picking, and it's based on what people, and you got to put some trust in the folks that you're meeting.
Yeah.
They're telling you the truth, and why go test it?
Sure. Yeah.
Not when there's other choices.
Right. Excellent. Back to working. What were the most difficult aspects of your job?
My career at P&O, it's like 36 years, so you could split it into 17 and 17 years. The first part of my upbringing was actually being a researcher. The second was becoming a manager.
Mm-hmm.
I've told you a bit about the research side, and I wasn't. I went into management kicking and screaming.
As many do.
How they wanted and tried to encourage me to go into management. They said, "Look, Wayne, you've got a good reputation. You have people skills. You have a good enough technical foundation that you could lead technical people." And I said, "Is that what it takes?"
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the reason I say that is because it's the management side of my work experience that was the most difficult. Because you are interacting with people, you're managing folks who predominantly white individuals, a few females, and you're dealing with big kids. And
sorry. No, it's funny because it's true.
Well, yeah. So you transition out of this environment of where you controlled a lot of stuff, your experiments, your writing, and then over here, you're trying to get these folks to understand what they need to do in order to succeed at the lab. And being in management was difficult.
Why'd you do it for so long?
as you leave the technical world, you, in order to be good technically, you have to be actively and building all the time. Once you leave it and you go into that realm, you now have left that behind, and to go back is not easy. So that's first and foremost. I like challenges, and there's challenges in the management side. Back to Dr. Wiley again. Before I really kind of left the technical world, he encouraged me to get my master's. He strongly encouraged me to get my PhD. And in doing that, it helped me technically as I did it. But then he said, now you have the credentials. Because in order to really move forward in this, he told me, he says, I knew I wasn't going to become a Nobel laureate. And he goes, I wanted to accomplish something. And he was a very visionary kind of guy. And he says, I was going to do that on the management side. His experience in the management area said, he goes, you could do this. You should follow that track. And so he encouraged me to go that route. And doing that, once you get into it, if you want challenges, you take the challenge and you move forward and you overcome certain things. And so by doing that, I got exposed to a lot different world in the area of technology and research and development. And one thing led to the next. And you then start to somewhat enjoy it. In management, what you primarily deal with are the bad actors and bad incidences, we'll call it. You don't get to focus a lot on the good. You allow that to happen. You make sure that the environment that is happening in stays safe, encouraging, positive, and then you deal with when there's a safety issue or there's a behavioral issue, you learn to deal with it. An interesting conversation I had when I first became a manager, there was a lab director, this is after Bill Wiley had passed, and I had done a few management deals, but Bill Madia came in as lab director, and there was going to be some opportunities, and he brought me in and we talked, and I'll never forget this conversation. He goes, yeah, you've taken statistics, haven't you? And I go, yeah. He goes, yeah, I've done quite a bit of statistical stuff. He says, well, this laboratory is made up of, it's a subpopulation of population. Oh, yeah, well, that makes sense, yeah. He goes, so, all the stuff that happens out in the population is the same things that happen inside this lab and the same people. And so, the things you might find and what you need to do is, your number one job is to protect the laboratory. You're a manager now. You must protect the lab. And you will find there are people that steal, there are people who are sexist, there are people who, he went down through the list of the bad stuff that happens out in the population. Some of those same people working here. And I'm like, yeah? He says, your job is to make sure you understand those individuals, and if they exist, and if they're bringing about negative things that are happening in the laboratory, you need to find those out. People that drink on the job. Now, say I was relatively young, okay, and you hear this and you're like, whoa, what did I get into? And that opened my eyes up to what my job was. And people that will try to cut corners, people who are not going to do the right things from a safety point of view. That made me think so much differently about how I managed. And it really helped me because I did find certain situations that were happening. You can see certain behaviors. I didn't take psychology or sociology. I never took management classes. Okay,
Mm.
you'll learn by doing. I got to go to some, Sloan management deals, and they had some management training deals. But you learn, and as I said, I learned a lot on the technical side. I just took those same skills and learned more about how to be a manager. And as time went on, I learned how to enjoy it. So that's it in a nutshell, really. And I stayed into it because I kept getting other opportunities. Could have left and gone to other sites and had job offers at other places, but tended to stay within P&L because I felt comfortable in the area as well as my family too.
How did your racial background figure into your work experiences?
My racial background?
Yeah.
Being black and being in there?
Yeah.
I had several assistants. Here's the thing: a game I used to play with my assistant. I was a hiring manager, and my tonation and my ability to speak and whatever, I would have conversations with some individuals on the phone, and I don't think they knew I was black. Okay, unless they, maybe back in certain times they didn't have Google and they didn't Google and look it up, but some of them didn't. So I told my secretary, okay, when this guy comes in, I want you to watch his expression when he walks in and I'm in the office, and he walks to the door and sees me. And my secretary, White, she's like, oh, okay. So she would walk him in and she would look at him, and their first is they stop. And right then, they weren't expecting me. Now I don't want to make it sound like that's a bad thing, but that shows you, a person comes in and then we sit down and we talk through the job and what do they want to, what is it they're, I'm going to talk to them just like I talk to anyone else, no matter what color you are. And I think they tend to get a somewhat of a comfort, but being black in a predominantly white institution, I mean not just P&L, the institution of science,
Mm-hmm.
and it's different. And I learned early on that you must be aware as best you can when someone's for you or when they're not.
Mm.
Okay? You can make that measure, and I had to do that on a number of occasions. But being a hiring manager and then being involved in that kind of stuff, and you want to be fair. Some individuals would come to me, black individuals who were experiencing totally not even in my department, and want to know if there's anything I could do for them. Like, in some cases, you have to be careful about where you go out and what questions you ask about other managers. But I had to do that for some individuals, and I was willing to. But it was a challenge. I enjoyed it for the most part.
Yeah. In what ways did the security and or secrecy at Hanford impact your work or daily life?
Oh, I had the highest clearance you could have. I mean, it's called sensitive compartmental information. It's like top secret in the Army. So I did a lot of classified work.
Mm.
In limited areas, in what they call a SCIF, which is sensitive compartmental information facility, which is the next level. Quite impactful. I'll tell you, in the trainings, there's a phrase I heard: for life. You had to keep this information that's going to be provided to you confidential and secret for life. I was like, whoa. So when you are in that kind of environment and you're being shared that kind of information, you learn to be very careful about your speech,
Mm-hmm.
what you talk about, what you don't talk about. Very enlightening. It's a thing called need to know. So you're only privy to what you needed.
Right.
Okay? So you weren't exposed to everything. But for what you're exposed to, you understood why it was sensitive. Okay? So it has a fundamental impact on how you viewed the sharing of information. Absolutely. And you know what? As Americans, tell Americans, there's some stuff you just don't need to know. Everybody thinks everything should be free and out there, and everybody should know everything. No. And that's as much as I say.
Okay. All right then. What did you know or learn about the prior history of African American workers at Hanford?
Only through what people told me. I mean, I learned a lot in the article you sent that I didn't know. I didn't know the living conditions. I knew they were relegated to East Pasco. But that one picture in there reminded me of Louisiana.
The one of the shacks.
Shacks.
Yeah.
That's the way it was in Louisiana. And I didn't realize that existed here that way in Pasco.
From your perspective, what were their most important contributions in the areas of work, community life, and civil rights?
Here?
Yeah.
I would say that the individuals who came here were courageous, were the ones who took a lot of the brunt of racism. As the article put it, Jim Crowism. You know, the movement from the South to the North was no different than the movement from the South to Chicago than the movement to here. They experienced some of the same things. Those individuals set in, as I said, for me, set a path where I could actually thrive here. Without what they experienced and going through, and hurdles they had to go through, like opening up the ability for me to live anywhere in the Tri-Cities. They did that. I didn't. A lot of what they experienced and what they went through. And you know what? That's the same as it is in America. Okay? I mean, there's a lot of patterns of the same. I was shocked to hear that Kennewick was the Birmingham of the Northwest. I mean, I guess Portland was pretty bad.
Yeah.
My understanding is the Northwest was probably that new horizon. I mean, I think people that lived here didn't know or didn't expect that migration to this general. You know, the dam and the Hanford project. So a lot of government projects brought a lot of minorities this way. It was the idea that there was work
Mm-hmm.
and that they actually could get work.
Mm-hmm.
Is what brought them here. I don't believe, and why you don't see the numbers, the number of blacks that came to the Northwest was nothing like what went to Chicago in the mid, in there. I mean, a lot migrated to the main cities.
Mm-hmm.
Not as many here. And I don't really know much about Seattle. And the Northwest doesn't have a really high African American population. Again, I've seen the numbers sometimes, but it's pretty low. So, point being is, not as many came, and I think they got the brunt of that racial, because a lot of the Southern whites also came for the same reason.
Yeah.
But they came in much larger numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I think it provided a platform for me to do reasonably well here.
Great. What were the major civil rights issues for African Americans at Hanford and in the Tri-Cities during your time here?
Equal access to work, equal access to promotions. Many were relegated to certain types of jobs. I even hear it, matter of fact, just like yesterday, was at the barber, went to the barber shop. A black individual that I hadn't seen in a while was working at P&L, and he said he had to leave because he wasn't being given opportunities for promotion. But then he got called by one of the other Hanford contractors and said, "Hey, we got a supervisor's job for you." Now, of course, he shifted and went.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, why was there an opportunity there and not in P&L? Don't know. But it tells you something, that these things happen, and they happen more often than you might think. I would say something I learned through some training, actually, and it's called unconscious bias. I don't know if you've heard that term.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But maybe you could explain it for the sake of the interview.
People unconsciously make biases. They don't realize they're doing it. It is probably, it is from their upbringing. They have a built-in bias that expresses itself, but it's unconscious to them.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they recognize that they have this bias, they don't see it happening. They just think this is just a normal occurrence for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think within P&L and other management situations, people have them, and they don't realize it until something brings it to the forefront for them to, one, accept that it exists. I make that statement because they will say it isn't, but it's theirs. I've got them, you've got them, she's got them. Oops, talking about campers. Everybody has them. It may not be about race. It could be about religion. It could be about just about anything. It could be about foods. May have never tested. Some people may have never tasted Mexican food, but I wasn't. That wasn't taught that.
Right. They just don't. They just know they don't like it.
Yeah, for some reason, just don't like it.
Yeah.
What? Anyway, that unconscious bias is a big deal. Still today, and that is something that I got exposed to, and I also share that with a lot of other managers to get them to understand and how to expand their consciousness about how they make choices, make decisions.
What actions were and are being taken to address those issues of civil rights and? Yeah.
I think they're talked about a lot more now. I believe in some cases, some things were brought about within the lab because it was regulated. I may forget this agency's name. I think it's called OFCCP, Office of Federal something Compliance. They monitored the contract, and there are certain things that in order to have a federal contract, there are some issues around racial, ethnic, women requirements that in order for you to hold this federal contract, you must comply to.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that drives behavior and management action.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad to say that a lot of things that happen in America is not necessarily done because it's the right thing to do, because they got forced to do it. Some through regulation. And I think some of what happens in the lab was driven by being reviewed and being under certain types of consent orders that they must do a better job.
Yeah.
I saw that happen, and there is a lot of individuals within the lab who truly do have a desire to see change.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them may be hampered by the environment they're in. They have good intentions, but unless it's driven all the way down, it just doesn't happen. So I've seen a cultural change within the lab over probably a 15 or 20 year period. Slowly but surely, people with their arms around the fact that, and once, I brought in a lot of black students from historically black colleges through a lot of programs. And once they see that these individuals could perform and they could do just well, they had credentials, it's just that they didn't go out to certain venues that exposed them to that population was there.
Right.
And I think once they started seeing those and they said, oh, okay, there was a little more comfort in that. I think more has happened over time. And a lot, and you'll find champions, okay? You'll find people willing to open up and willing to take, in some cases, I think they're taking a risk. And they do, which is it was and is very encouraging.
Mm. Who are the important leaders of civil rights efforts in this area?
Well, you had Webster in here, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one. I think that C.J. Mitchell, because he had a platform that he could. When you look at the Access, that organization, it has done a lot. Because it approached it from an exposure thing, a cultural thing,
Mm-hmm.
and a gathering of information, and then presenting it to people.
Mm-hmm.
What's Elle's last name? Eleanor. She's the one that runs the Juneteenth pageant. I think her last name's Sparks, because she married a Sparks, Wayne Sparks. Is she on your list to interview?
I don't know. We've interviewed Eleanor Moore, not the same Eleanor.
No.
Okay, Eleanor
Eleanor Moore is is Leonard's mother.
Yeah. Eleanor
But
Sparks.
look up Juneteenth in the court. I think it's her name, short name is L, but Sparks. She's the director of Juneteenth. If you can get an audience with her, I think you will get a very good. And she's heavily in the black churches. She leads the gospel singing.
Do you know her well, or?
Yeah, I know Elle.
Okay.
If you want, I'd call her and say, pass on your name or something.
I find that's some of the most helpful when doing these, especially across cultural barriers. It's just trying to peer into a different community, and that introduction helps a lot.
I'll do that.
Thank you. I would really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's just it makes it so much more smooth
And she has had some situation within the lab down to racial issues.
Okay.
And I remember and she would come to me as one of those people that came to me and asked, this is what happened, and I'd bring it up with other managers saying, this shouldn't be happening to her, and the guy, I'm not going to say his name, he had a pretty abrasive personality in the first dang place. He just more of it got exposed, and she wasn't going to put up with it.
Yeah.
And some people just put up with things, right?
Yeah.
But I'll make sure that I give her your phone number and she calls you.
Thank you. What were some of the notable successes in addressing civil rights issues in the area that you noticed or were a part of?
Never really part of any. Seeing whenever they would have a soul food event, how welcoming, and people would just flock to it. You know, when they did that, because anything about food, people just I don't know what it is about food, but it brings them out, and then they would get a cultural lesson at the same time. Those kind of events always brought about real positive celebration, and across racial lines. Juneteenth was another one. Get people that rallied around it. Those kinds of events are the ones I remember the most, that are more positive. I rarely saw any large protests. I remember when I was on the board at Columbia Basin College. I was a trustee, and it was happened that Katrina occurred,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a huge the issue of poverty just rose its ugly head.
Yeah.
And people, so I put on 3 workshops for poverty that were held at the campus. I say that because I don't believe people realized how many black individuals lived in New Orleans. It's like greater than 50%, maybe it was 60%. It was a very large percentage.
Mm-hmm.
People didn't understand why these people didn't get out.
Mm-hmm.
And so events were held so that people recognize when you're poor and somebody says get in your car and leave, you don't have a car. How are you leaving? No buses are coming down to take anybody anywhere.
Right.
These people were trapped.
Yeah.
And the poverty level in New Orleans was I think it was like 50% in poverty. Mostly black, but also white. Well, I bring that story up because people here, once they started we had these workshops, they were like, wow, they didn't realize you don't get it in the news. The news wasn't sharing it. They just showed the aftermath.
Right.
And so I had a young man who was working for me, a black individual. Now, I had a lot of relatives that lived, I think I counted 40, 42. And many of them were reasonably well off. I mean, middle class. But they were devastated, right? So this one young man who was a black scientist, I helped him get his PhD. His mom lived down there near one of my relatives, and gave him time off so he could go down and help his mom. I bring these little ones up because people in the lab, there was a connection now, and I could tell them, I have relatives down there, I'm sending money, whatever, I didn't physically go down. These people are out there, and that's a huge black community. And that brought an enlightenment about poverty and racial perceptions. And by having those workshops, we had a lot of the agencies come in, and there was a lot of talk. It's primarily about poverty, and they realized how much poverty was in the Tri-Cities. How many people lived in poverty? The numbers were shared, and people were surprised. I think the folks that work at the laboratory are a lot more affluent.
Yeah.
You tend to stay where you're most comfortable, right? There's also a financial culture. People will stay amongst people who have money.
Right. Well, we segregate ourselves based on class, which often breaks down on race. And
yes, it does.
People with money buy houses in new subdivisions, and they move farther away, and they just don't interact anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And the people without money get left behind.
Yeah.
And those neighborhoods decay because of the and there's just, it compounds the problem.
So the whole issue of poverty brought in a perspective of both race and class to this community, and there was a lot of conversation around it. Just the fact that just because a person is homeless doesn't mean they're a drug addict or they're this. No, an unfortunate thing happened to them where they were out home because they didn't have the money.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're bad people. I mean, if you look at that happened, and so Katrina brought a different type of conversation in this community. I think it did across the country, but it happened here, and people, I think, were a little bit more aware. But as with everything, it fades.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about some of the kind of the successes of addressing civil rights in the area. What were some of the biggest challenges?
In order to get people to come and live here, as far as black individuals, there's not a lot for them. I think that's a major impediment. And I think just the area itself, just its physical location, the actual population of African American here is, I think, it's probably around 2%. I mean, it's low.
Yeah.
The Hispanic population is probably more around 30-ish, Tri-City wide. Check my numbers on that one. But in Pasco, it's probably more like 70.
Yeah, it's. I think it's overall we're almost at. It's almost at around 50. I think.
Overall in the whole Tri-Cities?
I think last time I checked, at least in schools, and this because I taught.
Schools, yes.
Taught a class in American history, and Pasco was about 70% Latino.
Yes.
Kennewick's about 50. Richland's about 20 to 25.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you average that out, you get somewhere probably around 40 to 50.
Maybe 40 to 50. Okay.
But it could be 30 to 40.
You're
it's still
pretty
significant.
Yes, I mean, real significant. So, the fact that we have that's changing. That's what's changed here. I think it's no different than the rest of the country. There's a fear factor. I mean, I think you see all this immigration topics and fear. It has a lot to do with that changing face of America.
Yeah.
I think you're seeing some of that here. I know you're seeing some of that here. Okay?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how people want to react to it. I sit on the board for Catholic Hospital. In fact, at the present time, I'm the chair of the board. And in looking at your service areas and looking at the makeup of who comes in for services, and you're having to deal with the poor and the vulnerable. We have 3 hospitals, Lourdes, Trios, and Catholic. Catholic being the biggest. We have probably 55 to 60% of the market. Trios has about 20 to 25. And Lourdes is a critical care hospital, so it's going to be low. It's restricted to 25 beds, and it has probably 10-ish% of the market. I tell you that because in working in that scheme of things, you can see how people's attitudes will get to who's the primary customer set. And the more and more people are of the Medicaid, which is health care for the poor, and of course with the changing baby boomer retirement deals, a lot more Medicare, and those are hard to balance because you get paid less for those for services than you do from the commercial market. And in that comes a conversation around who is the makeup of your customers.
Right.
And so I hear conversations. And I said, well, that is who we are. That's who we have to serve. We've got to figure out how we're going to serve those better. And so people will tend to eventually coalesce around certain aspects of race, of what you're seeing, and understand that's who our customer is. And it's actually very positive.
Mm.
I've seen a very positive change. And when you have when you want to make sure people understand and represent, and I represent myself as well as I can in those scenarios. So it's the Tri-Cities is going through a change. With, like you said, the Hispanic population being as large as it is, they're being more impactful, both from the dollar as well as what they want to see for services. You have some people who says, why does everything have to be in Spanish and English? You looked at who we're serving. It has to be. We must do that in order to be fair, right? So I've seen those. I see them happening. And it's a good thing. So the Tri-Cities, you notice I always just say Tri-Cities. I'm not a native. Well, I guess I am now. But
I was going to say, you've been here a lot longer than I have.
I didn't grow up here.
Sure.
Right? So I just look at it as 3 cities. I call things Tri-Cities.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if we were consolidated. But
Me too. It could just be one city called Tri-Cities. Yeah, I know.
it's the way I put it anyway.
Thought that.
So I hope for the better. I mean, I stay active. Even though I retired, I stay active and involved in things in the community. Less than I was, but enough to see change.
Yeah. I wanted to just real quick kind of fill in some previous information. Where did you get your master's and PhD? Was it
what my master's I got through what they used to call the Joint Center for Graduate Study.
right here?
WSU.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yeah.
And I got it through the University of Washington because that's who offered that particular degree.
Right.
When I went to get my PhD, it had become WSU, and I was the first person who was able to stitch together a PhD program that was a joint between the main campus and here. They had this thing called the residency rule. Basically what it said was you must spend at least 2 years of your PhD on campus, on the main campus.
Right. Probably because they want your residence money.
That's not the way they present it to you.
Well, of course not.
They say what we believe is necessary is for you to be able to be embroiled in the academic environment for which you will
pay handsomely.
No, not paying handsomely. It's just that will make the foundation for your PhD.
Yeah.
What a crock.
Yeah.
But I had to spend. I had Karen DeVolf was the provost. We worked it out. She got approval through the main campus that I did 2.5 semesters on the campus. So I had to travel back and forth, left my family here, yada, yada, yada.
Wow.
And then I finished it out here. Matter of fact, I had my office down here in the basement. I finished out here. So I got my PhD through Washington State University. I was the first person to get a PhD in environmental and natural resource sciences.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
I was the very first person. That's not always good because you're the guinea pig.
Right.
And I really questioned whether I was going to go and get it, but Dr. Wiley, he is a tyrant. He said, that's the credential thing.
Yeah, right.
If you look at me, I mean, I was getting close to 40. I think I was in the early 90s when I jumped off the cliff and did it. I was leaving an environment. A scientific environment, where I knew who my mentors were. I knew who my colleagues were. They were supportive, and I was going to go into a whole different thing on campus with professors I didn't have any clue who they were, they didn't have necessarily have my best interest in mind. So I did that, they, they had my life in their hands, and that's a scary thing. At least it was for me.
Yeah.
Going and doing that. But I did it, and I worked my way through it. And as I say to people, and they go, "Well, what does it take to get a PhD?" And I said, "Well, I'm very simple in my approach as a thing." I said, "Well, you only have to do two things: satisfy the graduate school, satisfy your committee, get them to sign off on the documents. Once you've done that, you're done." But it's not easy to do either.
Right.
They go into those, and long story short, I ended up getting it. And, I think I was the first person, because at the time when I finally got it, I got it as if I was a WSU Tri-City student, and I was the first person. So now a lot of other people now don't have to do the residency program. There's PhD programs here, but that's where I got my education. So my bachelor's was WSU, master's was University of Washington, PhD WSU.
Oh. When you came here in 1975 and then came back, how did you feel at the time about working, if not directly on the development of nuclear weapons, at a site that played a large essential role in the development of nuclear weapons?
Well, let me correct you.
Okay.
The National Laboratory is in Richland. It has some facilities that happen to be on the Hanford site.
Right.
So I never really worked for Hanford. How's that? Rather than, I worked at Hanford only because the facilities were on the southern part of the site.
You did work for a Hanford contractor.
Well, I don't even count that.
Okay.
That was something I did to make some money.
Certainly, though,
But we had an association with the Hanford site.
Right.
I did projects that were related to problems at the Hanford site. Some of the waste issues, some of the burial issues. Yes, but I always want to correct people. I never worked in my, let's say, my real career.
Right.
So, how did I feel about working at the Hanford site, the thing that was associated with the bomb?
Yeah.
I remember I'm a scientist. That was one of the greatest scientific discoveries ever. Although, what it did to Japan was horrific. But yet, it's the same science that creates nuclear power. So, it's scientific discovery. I'm good with it. So, I never had any, as far as waste disposal and its impact on the environment and all that, I understand a lot of that. I think a lot of it gets overblown. There are contaminants, yes. Some of them got in the river, yes. But there is actually more negative impact from fertilizers going into the Columbia River than there was with radioactive material. Most of the problems at Hanford, the waste problems, are pretty contained. There are certain amounts that are in the subsurface. Granted, they're there. But they're there. Don't be going out and drilling a well down there and pulling up water to drink. Wouldn't be a good thing. So I have probably maybe a slightly different perspective. But I'm very comfortable. Just again, because my background in science, and I got to study a lot of those waste contaminants. Matter of fact, my PhD was related to one of the components, carbon-14, and its transport mechanisms through the subsurface, explaining exactly how it happens, what happens, and I was able to prove that the general understanding was incorrect and how it is retained. So I have an association.
What do you think is the most important legacy of the Hanford site?
Legacy. Most important legacy. Well, it helped end the war. Some people may not be there's a debate on whether we should have dropped the bomb or not. I'm not probably telling you anything you don't already know and heard. But that is its legacy. It's connected to the bomb. That is, and now there are some scientific advances that are being made associated with the cleanup that have now been able to use in other cleanup activities that are related to Hanford and what was done in Hanford. Transport of materials above ground. This whole vitrification plant that's going in. There's a vitrification plant, I think, in the UK, but this is going to be way bigger, much more complex. There's going to be science there has been science that's come out of it from understanding what they had to do, and I think there'll be further. So the first legacy is the bomb. The second is, what are the spin-off technologies that we're going to see from what we study in the creation of the vitrification plant?
What would you like future generations to know about working near Hanford and living in Richland during the Cold War?
Say it again.
What would you like future generations to know about working near Hanford or related to Hanford and living in Richland during the Cold War?
Present and future generations. If you want to be involved from a scientific point of view in problems that are challenging, you come here. You come to be in the lab or you come to work at the site. You are going to experience science challenges that you're not going to find anywhere else. National labs, there's more than just this one. Okay, so we always, in part of my recruiting of individuals, is you want to come and be involved in scientific discovery that is new, challenging, and transferable. You come work at the lab. You want to take on a challenge that's like nowhere else as far as waste disposal. You work at Hanford. Now, Hanford has a lot of different aspects of that cleanup, from the mundane, people just driving trucks, they're moving dirt from here to there, burying it, to the people who have to put together the vitrification plant and take on the challenges of putting together a system never been done before. So that's, if I put it in a nutshell, that's the way I put it.
Is there anything else you'd like to mention related to migration, work experiences, segregation, and civil rights, and how they impacted your life at Hanford and in the Tri-Cities?
The way I look at a lot of those issues, you just put them all together. I always say to folks, me as a black individual in America, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have had the opportunities I had if it wasn't for civil rights. If it wasn't for affirmative action, for all those people who piss and moan about affirmative action, I would not have had, and I know it to this day, I would not have gotten the opportunity to go to school, gotten a job at P&L. You might call me an affirmative action hire. I'll be proud of that. Okay? So I believe as an individual, I've had, I ride on the shoulders of many. I will tell you, this is another story. have an aunt. She's passed away now. Auntie Anna. Auntie Anna was my mother's favorite aunt. When I was struggling to decide whether I was going to go and get my PhD, because seriously, I was like, why do I really want to go do this? I went down and sat with my aunt. She lived in what they call the jungle in LA. Not a good part of town. We sat in her room and she smoked. We're sitting there talking. I said, yeah, I'm trying to decide if I can do this. And she was pissed. She goes, wait, I have known you forever. And, me, your aunts and your uncles, we went through a lot of struggles, and they're offering you this opportunity to go back, and you'd be the only one in our family to get a PhD, and you're sitting here trying to decide whether you're going to do it or not? What is wrong with you? When you leave here, you go sign up right now. She made it apparent that I have opportunities because of her and others. And I won't forget that conversation. It is kind of part of why, I went through and did it. She was one of them, besides Wiley. And then, so a lot of what has happened in America, for those that might hear me speaking or whatever, and for those that might even know me, I may not have shared some of these things with them, but without those things happening, I could have been born in New Rose, Louisiana, and still be there under oppression. Because when I go back there, there's a lot of people who are not doing a whole lot, didn't get a whole lot of opportunity. But for many of those, I had my father who left and went out and became in the service, and we moved, and I got to be exposed to different things. That's who I'm made up of now. But without those, I have skills, but there's a lot of people that have skills.
Mm-hmm.
They just may not have the opportunity to express them. And a lot of the civil rights stuff, that's why I have the opportunity that I've had.
It's very well said, Wayne. Thank you for coming to interview with us.
Hey,
It's a wonderful
great.
interview.
Hopefully I said the right things or did the right things.
Yeah, no,